What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and one of my favorite companies to work with is Corsair, just because of how many areas they operate in. You may or may not know this, but other than CPUs, GPUs, and motherboards, Corsair makes every component in a gaming PC. This includes RAM, SSDs, cases, coolers, fans, power supplies, and even more. Because of all this, I decided to put together a gaming PC comprised entirely of Corsair parts. I want to thank Corsair for providing some of the parts for this video, and just as a disclaimer, this PC is using some last-gen core components, just because I haven't been able to get my hands on any of the new AMD CPUs or GPUs. With that being said, this is still an epic build featuring some pretty powerful hardware. So let's start off by talking about the CPU, which is one of the few parts that isn't Corsair branded. What I went with is the AMD Ryzen 7 3700X. This is an 8-core, 16-thread CPU that turbos up to around 4.3 GHz across all cores. For around $300, this is a really good value for the price and is even unlocked, meaning you can overclock it for even more performance. Having 8 cores means you can do a lot more than gaming, including stuff like 4K video editing and streaming gameplay to sites like Twitch. With all this being said, if you can get your hands on it, a Ryzen 5 5600X would be the better gaming option, but those likely won't be readily available until February or March of next year. This CPU does come with a pretty nice AMD Wraith cooler. This cooler has a pretty good sized aluminum fin array and is able to keep the CPU relatively cool and quiet. With that being said, I opted to upgrade to liquid cooling. What I went with is a Corsair H100i RGB Platinum. This is a 240mm all-in-one liquid cooler that features RGB on the pump block and does include RGB fans, which I ended up swapping them out for other fans, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is a great cooler in both aesthetics and performance. I didn't end up overclocking, but if you're looking to get the most out of a CPU through overclocking, this is a great option. Installation was super simple, and overall the H100i Platinum works great. Moving on to the motherboard, I went with a great value per dollar board in the ASRock B550 Pro 4. This is an ATX motherboard that offers a lot of great features for the price. It has 4 DIMM slots, multiple M.2 slots, and solid back panel I/O. It also doesn't hurt that it looks nice too, with a neutral color scheme that can fit in most builds. The VRMs on the Sky aren't the best, but they work fine for overclocking an 8-core CPU like our 3700X. In terms of memory, a system like this really should be using 32GB in my opinion. Yes, 16GB would be more than enough for gaming, but doing more heavy workstation tasks would benefit greatly from the increased RAM capacity. What I went with is a 2x16GB kit of Corsair Vengeance Pro RGB RAM. This is DDR4 memory running at 3600MHz, which is the perfect speed to pair with a Ryzen CPU. This RAM has some really nice RGB lighting that, just like the rest of the lighting in the system, can be controlled with Corsair's iCUE software. Moving on to storage, this is another area where Corsair has stepped up their game a lot in recent years. While they do have a Gen 4 NVMe drive in the MP600, I opted to go for the more value-oriented option of the MP400. This is a 1TB NVMe drive in the M.2 form factor. This is a Gen 3 drive, but performance is amazing, and at around $120, this is a good value for a 1TB NVMe drive. One thing I really like about M.2 drives is the fact they install in seconds and require 0 cables, unlike traditional 2.5-inch SSDs, which require a SATA power and SATA data cable. Moving on to the graphics card, I would have loved to use an RTX 3070 in this build, but just like you guys, I haven't been able to get my hands on one. For that reason, I went with the still powerful RTX 2070 Super. This is a great 1440p graphics card, being able to play most any game at 1440p with high settings. This is the EVGA XC model, which looks and performs really well. It has a dual fan design with a metal backplate and RGB lighting. For specific temps and performance, make sure to stick around for the benchmarks. Again, I would recommend going for a 3070 if you can get one, but with that being said, the 2070 Super is still an amazing graphics card. Moving on to the power supply, this is yet another area where RGB has managed to find its way in. This is Corsair's new CX650F. This is a 650 watt, 80 plus bronze power supply with fully modular cables, and you guessed it, a 120mm RGB fan. And while you might think you won't be able to see this RGB, in reality it acts as underglow and looks really cool, especially in the dark. 650 watts is more than enough for this build, but the power supply does come in a 750 watt version too if you're looking for more power headroom. Overall, this power supply is a bit impractical, but if you want RGB on every part possible, you can't go wrong with picking this unit up. Next, let's talk about the case. This is Corsair's new 4000D airflow case, which comes in at around $80. For $80, you're getting a well-built and designed chassis with 2 included fans and plenty of airflow. It has a tempered glass side panel, power supply basement, and everything else you could expect from a Corsair case. It was very easy to build in, and I'm really liking this case so far. It's definitely giving me flashbacks to my Corsair Obsidian 350D that I used to use for my personal rig. Now, like I said, this came with 2 included fans, which work great, but I opted to swap those out for Corsair QL120 fans. I used 6 in total, 3 at the front, 2 on the CPU liquid cooler, and 1 at the back. These are pretty much the best RGB fans that money can buy, with an insane 34 LEDs per fan. This, along with the Corsair IQ software, allows for nearly infinite lighting options. All in all, this is one of the best looking builds I've put together, and all the parts are very high quality and perform really well. Also, if you like these Corsair parts and want to see their custom water cooling Hydro X series of products, I would recommend checking out my most recent sleeper PC build, which is fully custom water cooled using Hydro X parts. I'll have that video linked in the description. So now that you've seen each of the parts and understand why I picked them, it's now time to talk about performance. The combo of the 3700X and 2070 Super is perfect for 1440p gaming. Let's start things off with my favorite battle royale game, Apex Legends. I tested this game at 1440p high settings on the new map that was recently released. Doing this resulted in an overall average of around 120 FPS, with dips in the low 100s during intense combat. Apex Legends ran great on this machine and felt very smooth and enjoyable to play. Moving on to COD Warzone, I also tested this game at 1440p high settings. Doing this resulted in the FPS staying in the mid 90s to low 100s. This was a very smooth and enjoyable experience, and if you wanted a locked 144Hz, you could always drop down some of the settings or go down to 1080p. Moving on to Borderlands 3, the hardest game I put up against the system, I tested at 1440p high settings using the built-in benchmark. Doing this resulted in a 72 FPS average, which is pretty good for a game as intensive as Borderlands 3. Next up is CSGO, which at 1440p pro settings, which is pretty much everything set to low, the system stayed around the 300 FPS mark most of the time. In Rainbow Six at 1440p high settings, the system put out a 268 FPS average using the built-in benchmark, which shows that for games like CSGO and Rainbow Six, the system is a bit overkill. Finally, I tested Shadow the Tomb Raider at 1440p high settings using the built-in benchmark. With these settings, the system output a 96 FPS average, which again is pretty impressive performance for a game like this at 1440p high. Overall, performance on this system is great. Sure, it is using last gen parts, but the 3700X is still a great value per dollar chip, and if you could snag a 2070 Super cheap on somewhere like eBay, then this is a combo you can't go wrong with. This system is pretty awesome in my opinion. All the RGB from the Corsair components look great, and the new 4000D airflow is an amazing case that I can highly recommend. If you guys are interested in that case or any other parts mentioned in this video, then make sure to check the description where each part will be linked. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And as always, this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.